Democratic National Convention has come to a close, and Kamala Harris has officially accepted the nomination as the candidate for the Democratic Party for president. Here with us now is Suttmann-Lea, Associate Professor of Government for Connecticut College, to talk about the full recap of the DNC and to talk about what's ahead as we inch closer to the general election. Ms. Suttmann-Lea, thank you for taking the time to join us. How are you today?
I am doing very well. Thank you so much for having me.
And glad to have you here. Of course, one of the big reasons for having this convention is to try to energize the base, and drawing a comparison between the DNC and the Republican National Convention certainly seemed like Democrats wanted to bring the energy. Does that really matter as far as getting sort of a post-convention bump in the polling?
So, yes, I'm glad that you brought up the post-convention bump. It is likely that Democrats will see some sort of a post-convention bump, as is usually the case with national party conventions. The question is, though, whether or not Democrats will be able to sustain that. And that is really what I'm going to be looking at, is how well are they going to be able to mobilize and get up their base supporters, as well as bringing in independents, persuadables, folks who are undecided.
And, you know, I wanted to ask you about Kamala Harris's speech, but while you're talking about that, I'm glad you brought that up, because it doesn't seem like there's a Venn diagram amongst Democratic voters. Some of them are voting specifically for Kamala Harris and Democratic policy proposals, whereas others are still casting more of an anti-Trump vote. And there is some overlap between the two, but it does seem like Democrats have to work on what exactly they want their primary message to be. Which one of those do you think might be best at energizing the base and getting independents to turn out in their favor?
This is a great question. So what political science research tells us is that sometimes focusing on the negative can be more mobilizing. Fear and anger can be a little bit more mobilizing sometimes than joy and hope. And at the same time, I do think that the Democratic campaign is striking a really impactful balance between those two things, contrasting Kamala Harris's candidacy with Donald Trump's candidacy. And it does seem like the American people, the Democratic Party, they are very hungry for something that is a little bit more hopeful, a little bit more joyful, while also not setting aside that more negative comparison and contrast with former President Trump.
Okay, so putting that into context, what were the big takeaways from Vice President Harris's speech last night?
For me, I believe that it was a chance for her to present herself and introduce herself to the country. I think those of us who follow politics, of course, know who she is and are familiar with her work, but I think that she did an excellent job of introducing herself to folks across the United States who might not be very familiar with her story, with her work. And so that was what really stood out to me. It's also worth noting that she did spend, by my count, about a minute talking about the war in Gaza and the push for the Biden administration to come to a ceasefire deal. And I felt that that was noteworthy, especially with the conversation around the protests that were happening at the convention. Was
there enough talk in that speech about policy?
Was there enough talk in that speech about policy? That is a great question. It's not a question that I necessarily feel comfortable offering sort of a yes or a no answer to. I think that conventions are, again, meant to introduce candidates to the public. Right. And I believe that candidate Harris knows that there are lots of questions about whether or not she should be speaking more to policy. And I will be looking very closely personally in terms of how she pivots post-convention to talk about her policy specifics.
Yes, and I appreciate your hesitancy to talk about that. If nothing else, it speaks to me to inscrutability of what is good politics. Not knowing exactly what to do at a given time. Like you said, do you just introduce yourself and energize the base, or do you start talking about policy that can then get picked apart? And this is why I'm not a politician. So, Suttmann-Lea, thank you so much for taking the time to join us to give us your thoughts on the convention. And thank you again for joining us this morning, this early on a Friday.
My pleasure. My pleasure.